As children, we often play these games of make-believe. We dress up in mummy or daddy's clothes, the loose shirts just hanging off us as we clomp around and pretend for a little while that we are the adult in the room. We pretend because that's the best way to learn how to be an adult. Young children can get away with this. They can dress up as doctors and pretend to be a doctor for a while. They can dress up as an adult and pretend to be an adult for a while. As an adult, you can have similar experiences. You're just not allowed to admit it. Because I'm sure you've had the experience of changing your clothes and having that change who you are, or at the very least, how you are. The person who puts on the suit and goes to the office and is very much in that office space, they're leading, they're collaborating, they're doing whatever needs doing in order to get the job done. And then when they get home, the suit comes off, the pajamas come on, and all of a sudden, they're in a very different state of mind. Clothes have a way of defining us. I dress like this because I enjoy the way that it makes me feel. It's very different to how I used to dress. And at that time, I enjoyed how that made me feel. But the point is that the outside and the superficial sometimes contains the most profound and the most interesting. So-called primitive cultures. You have a nomadic tribe. This tribe will likely have a chief. You could call this the political leader, the person who is in charge and makes all of the decisions. Except there's also the spiritual leader. You can call them the shaman. And in many of these cultures, to put a modern Western spin on it, they dress for the occasion. If they're about to go to war, they put on the war paint. If they want to learn how to hunt, they might put on a wolf pelt, dance around the fire. Wearing the fur of the wolf helps them think as a wolf. It helps bring out that predator inside of them, the hunter. Or they might put on the skin of the deer. And by putting on the skin of the deer, they can get inside the mind of the deer, learn how better to hunt it by being as if the deer is them and they are the deer. And of course, some of these tribal societies, these nomads, settle down. They become civilized. And over time, the chiefs give way to kings, queens. And the similar pattern repeats itself. Because the idea of the king being the ruler of the land, and yet that king having a spiritual advisor, is one that permeates our history and our mysteries. You can point to King Arthur and Merlin. You can point to King Herod and John the Baptist if you want to have more of an adversarial example of this. The point is that as the king can often lead the people's bodies, whereas the spiritual leader of the land has a way of leading their souls. And the kingdom really flourishes when the leadership has both a strong king and a strong spiritual leader, an absolute monarch and the wisest of priests. And to modern ears, this might sound a bit repulsive, this might be a bit offensive. So we did away with kings long ago, and with good reason. Kings of history were often cruel or stupid. At the very least, they infringed on the rights, the liberties, the sovereignties of people. But maybe we hate the king because our modern day kings, whether they're business leaders, prime ministers, presidents, whatever, maybe because they're so weak or so absent. I don't want to romanticize the idea of an absolute monarchy, because that is, after all, tyranny. Yet at the same time, there's something in the human soul, this human psyche, that yearns for something like that, but good. I mean, you can point to the fact that America has tried to recreate the royal dynasty concept. Bushes and Kennedys, the Clintons tried to form their own in their own little way. The idea of families having lots of power. You can even point to Kardashians as having a lot of cultural power. And then there are other families, the rich families, who contain and control quite a lot of influence over the policies, over the entertainment, over society as a whole. We gravitate towards these things as societies because it seems to be the way that we work. Part of us, even when we know it's not wise to do so, we yearn for kingship. And that's because the idea of the king is so much better than the king himself. We think of and we yearn for Aragon when we try to forget about who we actually end up with. The kings in reality often disappoint us, but that's often because the kings that we deserve, that we long for, are so much more than that, so much more impressive. I talked about kings and spiritual leaders. In many cultures, many traditions, they are both the same. And in fact, they're more than that. More than the idea of the king being a political ruler and the spiritual ruler. There's this concept that shows up in many cultures where the king is the land. Ancient Egypt had this with the pharaohs. The fertility of the king, as in his literal fertility, the number of children he'd have, how well he took advantage of the royal harem, shall we say, directly reflected the fertility of the land. If the king had many offspring, then the Egyptians knew that the Nile would be good to them and the seasons would be an abundant harvest. But if the king struggled to populate the world with his kin, then the land would struggle and the farmers would not be able to feed themselves or the rest of the kingdom. This idea of the king being not just someone who has political authority, but has like this spiritual authority, this real connection with the land, this ability to influence natural events. This shows up in our fairy tales. The idea of like the Fey king or the Fey queen, whose moods would change the weather, who was, no matter where you are in their land, they're always there, they're always listening. The trees listen, the rocks listen. But the very soil itself reflects their personality, their drive, their ambitions. This is what we think of on some level when we think of kings. The sort of person who can rewrite reality and change the entire kingdom, where the subjects are an extension of the king and not merely their subjects. There's this idea in medieval history of prima noctis. It's often translated as the right of the first night. And a lot of medieval sources talk about this. The idea that the lord or the duke or the king has the, shall we say, the first right with any woman in the kingdom on the day of her marriage. So before her new husband can consummate the marriage, their king or the lord has the right to do so first. And what's really interesting is that a lot of sources talk about this, but scholars disagree as to whether it actually happened, whether this is a real thing, whether any king actually had this right, or whether any duke actually took advantage of this. But it's quite an interesting thing. If you take the idea of the king away from the person and instead apply it to this concept of like the embodiment of the land. Because what happens if every newlywed couple on their first night offer up that sacred union to the land itself? They invite the kingship to enter their marriage. Well, if the husband takes on this spirit and acts as a king, not the petty tyrant, not the controlling or the tyrannical or the abusive, but the wise king, closer to Aragon. If he takes that on himself as he consummates the marriage, that is, in its own way, a blessing. And of course, we're talking about political kings. And then we're talking about this sort of metaphorical kingship of the land. If you find yourself struggling with some of the implications of this, if it sounds bizarre, or if it sounds uncomfortable, or if it leads to logical conclusions from these premises, you wouldn't necessarily want to go. I invite you to remember that the highest form of kingship is political. And there's this embodiment of the land. And then above that, we have the King of Kings. We have Jesus. And all that he represents. Now imagine a married couple. The first night of their marriage, they bring the Holy Spirit into that marriage, even into the most private and intimate moments of the bedroom. The Holy Spirit coming first, with husband and wife creating a marriage that's then offered up to God. This creates something beautiful. This is embodying the idea of putting God first. And this is one of the ways that you can bring about this idea of kingship. Not king, not tyrant, not despot, not ruler, but kingship. The sort of man who leads just by showing up, just by existing. A leadership so profound that it transforms the entire kingdom, all of the lands, even when he's not there. Where his wisdom is the wisdom of the land, where his fertility is the fertility of the land, where his strength and his self-control and his discipline reflects into every corner that he rules over. And if Jesus is that king, the Holy Spirit is that king, then something amazing can happen. Now I want to get practical with this, because this has been quite abstract so far. So I want you to consider what it would be like, and really take a moment to imagine this. What would it be like to sit on a throne? Now, a throne in one sense is just a chair. Again, it is something that is just physical. It is something that is superficial. A king is more than just his throne, except he's not. So the throne is so much more than the king. Even a simple throne, something that's made of wood or stone, but it's something that the king, and only the king, has sat in for generations. Then the throne becomes something much more. It even becomes more than a symbol, even though as a symbol it is something amazing. When a throne has had so many kings sitting in it, then it adopts either a literal magic or a form of psychological magic, which is really quite extraordinary. Because the prince, having grown up, exposed to the king is his monarch, is his ruler, yes, but he's also his father. He's also the guy that is there to teach him about the details of life. The king to the prince is someone who he eats with, who he drinks with, who they discuss all sorts of personal issues. It's a very different relationship than the typical subject to a king. But the prince has never sat on the throne. And they can't even imagine what it's going to be like to sit on the throne. The prince can't. It's impossible. They can get a bit of a vague idea. But until they actually sit in the throne and look out from that perspective, only then will they actually understand what it's like to be the king. Because that's the difference between the prince and the king, is that there can be many princes. You could have a dozen princes in the one royal family. There's only one king. And that throne has only ever had that one king at a time sit in it. If that's still a bit sort of out there, imagine what it'd be like to just sit in the president's chair in the Oval Office. Really imagine that. You think that even if you're just some guy, you're just walking around, you're a tourist on one of the White House walking tours and you just got lost, you sat in the chair, you wouldn't experience something. Saying that you wouldn't experience something that's so different from everything else you've ever experienced. Imagine that. You've got the desk in front of you. And yeah, it's been different desks, and yeah, the chair has changed, but the Oval Office, this perspective, where there's been this literal chair or a chair just like it in this exact spot. So much power. So much of the experience of the kingdom, of the nation, influencing and being influenced by what happens from the perspective of this seat. But as I say, it's not the same chair passed down from president to president. And that's one of the ways in which a democracy is inferior to a monarchy. Because the continuity contains a bit of magic on its own. But again, I'm not here to glorify and dramatize kingship. Many of them were bad people. They were indulgent. They were cruel. They were disconnected from reality and their obligations. But the idea of kingship, the throne containing kingship, if that's something you can imagine, then that's something you can take use of now. Because if you want some of that for yourself, if you want to be a wiser ruler, leader, and because everyone is a leader, fathers definitely are leaders, but even the lowest of employees in an organization is, in their own way, a leader in some small aspect. And that's why this idea of kingship resonates with us so much, and that's why we crave it so much. And so that's what we're going to do right here with this. Because you might not have a throne that goes back 20 generations or 20 dynasties of nobility, of leadership, of people making the hard decisions, people staring down their adversaries from this unique perspective on this unique throne. But you have a brain, and you can use that brain to at least get a sense of that with whatever you have at hand. This is no throne. This is a rather good but rather cheap stool, likely made in China, likely made from rather cheap material. It's solid, it can bear my weight. That's good enough. Because what if this was a throne? And there's nothing that says that it couldn't be. If I conquer a small but fruitful kingdom, maybe this is where I sit to make all of my decisions. And maybe my heir and their heir and their heir, they all sit on this. This can become a throne. Because the magic is never in the stone or the wood or the glass or the plastic or the steel. It's in how it can bear the weight of leadership. So just imagine that this is an ancient throne. Imagine this has borne the weight of kings going back generations. You can do that. Because maybe this is far older than it looks. Or maybe with your imagination you can change it. You can make it grander, more solid, more glamorous, more beautiful. Those things aren't required of thrones, but they certainly help. And just imagine that this is where kings have sat, of where peasants have grovelled before, of where emissaries from other kingdoms have stood, making desperate pleas, or offering tribute, or establishing alliances, or bringing news, making trades, making arrangements. A king might sit here to oversee banquets, weddings, festivals, declarations of war. Intruders might knock on the door to the throne room while the king sits here, encouraging and motivating his royal guard to hold the line. If this is that chair, if this is that throne, just imagine what it'd be like to sit. And when you get a sense of that reverence, and allow yourself to really feel that reverence, Even if this is just a simple piece of wood, even if it doesn't in reality have that history, you have a brain. You can be as if it does have this history, soaking up the literal and metaphorical blood of countless generations of rulers. So much wisdom and so much power emanating out from the person who sat here. And you get a sense of that awe, of that connection to history, of the realization that only a king could ever know what it's like to look out from that perspective. When you feel that, I invite you to be your own king, to take a moment and to, for the first time, assume your authority.